Let's talk about our quietly confident Missouri football team, as well as a middle of an SEC basketball schedule this coming year that the Tigers absolutely have to crush. All that and more right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso, and a man who will be checking out the W tonight as Caitlin Clark makes her WNBA debut. Got to check it out for at least a little bit because I'm very interested in her stardom. For sure. What makes her a star that she is? What makes stardom in general? I want to talk about that at the end of the program. But of course, we got to lead with Missouri. SEC basketball schedule is out. But you know what? I want to lead with football, of course. And by my count, the Tigers still have a few spots available that they could use scholarship-wise on the football team, and yet no visitors that we're aware of, as far as I can tell. And yet, I'd say that's a good sign for Missouri. I think they're very quietly confident right now, especially for an Eli Drinkwitz-led team. Not a lot of chirping so far out of the offseason camp from Missouri and company. Again, I like the quiet confidence. Certainly Eli Drinkwitz is dripping with confidence as usual. Just not a lot of noise, not a lot of bad news coming out of Missouri. Have you had any bad news whatsoever, legally, any of that stuff? It all seems good so far, knock on wood, as they say. Now, I'm sure I got the goat of a few Alabama fans yesterday, and just to be clear once again, what I'm saying is I'm not sure that Alabama is Missouri's toughest game. And I'm not predicting a horrible season for the Tide by any means. Certainly with a 12-team playoff, my goodness, a playoff appearance at this point in time is probably more likely for Alabama than not. I'm just saying I'm assuming nothing on May 14th, 2024 at this point. Just like, to be brutally honest, I'm not assuming anything with Missouri either. Hey, this is the off season. I've talked about how really high I think Missouri's upside is. I think it's as high as the best team in the country when it's all said and done. But again, just so we're clear here, I'm talking upside. If you want to talk about the downside, well, as we've all said and noticed, Missouri won 3 really close games on plays that three plays basically could have hinged one way or the other. I'm, of course, talking about Harrison Mevis's field goal, even more so the do-or-die 4th and 17 against Florida. And I would say the Kentucky fake punt as well. If that ball's not complete, what happens in that game? It's at least worth asking. So again, if Missouri could have been 7-5 last year, it's certainly not crazy to think 7-5 is on the table, that type of thing this year as well. Especially Missouri had a lot of positive injury fortune last year for the most part. Hey, hopefully that obviously continues in 2024. But I would say, though, the more you look at it, and this was my main point yesterday, and I can get a little deeper into it, really that Missouri schedule, which I called navigable when it first came out, really it's looking even more navigable and downright easy, relatively speaking, for an SEC schedule, and that's the point. Relatively here, it's looking pretty easy because not only is Alabama, I'm not going to say they're in disarray by any stretch of the imagination. They're just in a lot of transition right now. And what that transition looks like, again, there's a lot of more unknown and variables there than I think maybe a lot of Tide fans would like to admit. We're talking about a team that has had tons of exits and not a metric ton of additions either. Some really key additions for Alabama. But again, I'm just assuming nothing. And again, more to the point with Missouri's schedule, Texas A&M, which on paper, that's Missouri's second toughest game, if you believe my friends over at FanDuel Sportsbook. ATM, they have tons of turnover too. The Aggies have a new football coach as well. So again, your two toughest opponents on paper, not only with a lot of turnover in the roster, you're talking about the first year with a new head coach as well. That's always a challenge. And I think I'm not bad-mouthing either Mike Elko or Coach DeBoer out in Alabama. I think both of them are good football minds. We'll see what happens. Frankly, Texas A&M is just a difficult job for a lot of reasons. But those are your two toughest games, followed by Oklahoma. Fortunately, Missouri gets Oklahoma at home. That's definitely an advantage. And again, according to the lines, your fourth toughest game right now, Auburn, where Missouri is as much as a 10-point favorite I've seen at various spots, including FanDuel Sportsbook. So my opinion, if that's your fourth toughest game, it's been a really fortunate draw in the offseason for Missouri, if just in terms of stacking up wins, because I really think I don't think Auburn is going to be very good this season. Maybe it ultimately works out for Hugh Freeze, but I just think this isn't going to be the year. If you think there's going to be a big jump forward for Auburn this year, I'm just not seeing it based on what I heard from spring football and the people I talked to. So again, you look at Missouri's schedule, very navigable, good in terms of stacking up total wins. If you want to bet the over, I would definitely, in terms of the total wins, I would definitely lean toward the over in terms of Missouri and 9.5 wins total for the season. At the same time, if this schedule ends up being at the season much weaker than we maybe even expected at the beginning, that could actually play against Missouri at a certain point. If you have two losses, well, you want those two losses and the rest of your schedule to look strong, because obviously a two-loss resume is no guarantee for a playoff spot. And since we're talking about this upcoming football season, I thought this might be a decent moment to review some of the new rule changes coming. We've heard about the 2-minute warning in both halves, similar to the NFL. Also, a lot of these changes really are just making the college game a little bit more like the NFL. Tablets are coming in terms of, hey, you can look at film on your tablet instead of getting printouts or just talking to your coach upstairs, that type of deal. Now, maybe the most interesting part of this, there's going to be a designated player communication system like the NFL as well. So not only will the coach be able to talk to the quarterback on one side of the ball, but typically the middle linebacker will have that green sticker on the back of his hat as well. So it could be anybody on the offensive or defensive side of the ball, but certainly I've never heard anybody but the quarterback have that designation. Typically, it's the middle linebacker who does it as well. So think about what Nick Bolton does for the Kansas City Chiefs on Sundays, and that's what it's going to look like for somebody, one of those off-ball linebackers, it would seem. But basically, you're going to have that communication until the ball is snapped or there's 15 seconds left on the play clock, whichever comes first. So a lot of times with 15 seconds left, that's going to be a majority of the snaps, I would think, for Missouri. You're still going to be having it be on Brady Cook at that point. It's not as though Missouri's running the hyper Josh Heupel type of offense of the past here. So a lot of that, the last 15 seconds, if there's going to need to be a play change, something like that, it seems like it would be a lot more ideal for it to be on Brady Cook as opposed to then, oh, now do I need to look back to the sideline for another audible? So be interesting to see how all of that plays out, in my humble opinion. And one more rule change that is going to be similar, not really so much to the NFL, but more to the NBA, which is there's going to be coach interviews allowed, head coach interviews after the first and third quarters. And I'll just say, has Greg Popovich taught us nothing? Do we need these interviews whatsoever? He tried so hard to just be as curt and rude as possible to get the NBA to get rid of the things. Well, they won't do it, and now we're bringing them to college football as well. Not really sure the point of any of this stuff. Who's asking for it? I think the sideline reporters and the coaches alike would like to skip it. And I'll just say, as a TV viewer, I'm good with skipping it as well. So solidarity with Coach Pop. But you know what? Coming on the show, since I brought up Coach Pop and basketball here, let's talk some Mizzou basketball. The SEC schedule is out. We don't have the dates, but we do know Missouri's opponents home and away. I'll break it all down for you, including a change to the teams Missouri is doubling up on, playing twice in addition to Arkansas. Got lots to break down for you here coming up on the program. But you know what? Before we get there, I got to talk about LinkedIn Jobs, because when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. And LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you find and hire professionals you can't find anywhere else. Even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, more than 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit another leading job site. So, if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. I'm sure some of you, out of a force of habit, have Fox Sports or ESPN on in the background in your office all day. Well, I have a better option for you. Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming matches. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And even though the size of the SEC, of course, is going to expand from 14 to 16 teams this year with the addition of Oklahoma and Texas, the size of the football schedule remains the same, still 8 games. And you're also talking about still an 18-game schedule in the SEC for basketball as well. And basically the same format, although a bit of a change for Missouri. In the past, Missouri has played Arkansas, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M twice, a home and away setup for those 3 squads. Well, this time Arkansas remains, so the Tigers will get to see John Calipari once again at home this season and also at Bud Walton Arena in Fayetteville. But instead of Ole Miss and Texas A&M, the Tigers getting the Oklahoma Sooners and Vanderbilt twice this year as well. Now, I will say on the Vanderbilt side, that's got to be a bit of an advantage for Missouri. Things have not been going well for Vanderbilt. And, well, if you're a Vanderbilt fan who happens to be listening to this, you're probably saying, hey, screw you. At least we didn't go 0-19 last year, including the SEC tournament, of course. Touche, I have no comeback for that whatsoever. But the God's honest is, if you're breaking down this schedule for Missouri next season, if you're looking at some obvious victories, well, the 2 Vanderbilt games are among them. No question about that. And you've got to hope that Missouri can win a road game at Georgia as well. And I would say a home game against LSU. But beyond that, there really aren't any obvious victories on this schedule for Missouri in 2024-25. But there are some obvious losses, I would say, for sure. I mean, just based on recent history and, of course, history as well. And especially if you're talking history, Missouri's done rather poorly against Mississippi State. So going on the road to Starkville, you got to go L there at this point if you're just being an honest observer. How about Auburn? They were pretty doggone good last year. Tough to win in Auburn for Missouri or anybody else. Same thing with Tennessee and Texas on the road. So this is going to be a tough road slate for Missouri next year without question. And a whole bunch of really, again, other than I would say Alabama and Kentucky, those are probably probable losses for Missouri at this point at home. A probable win with LSU, just a whole lot of toss-up games. So to me, if you take those games that I just said that were likely wins, likely losses, that's a 4-6 outcome for Missouri. So that basically leaves you with 8 games left that are going to decide Missouri's fate. And they're going to need to go probably 5-3 or 6-2 in the following games. 2 against Arkansas, 2 against Oklahoma. There's half your games right there that need to be won at a high rate. So Missouri probably needs to take 3 out of 4 against Arkansas and Oklahoma. I'm saying to make the NCAA tournament here, of course. Then you throw in at Florida, which is, frankly, could be thrown into the probable loss column. But for this one, we'll stick with it. Ole Miss at home, South Carolina home, and finally Texas A&M at home. All 3 of those certainly winnable on paper, but hey, losable as well. When you've been stung by an 0-19 campaign, most recently like I've been, it's hard to get real cocky as a Missouri basketball fan. But certainly, this should look like a very different squad in 2025 at the very least. Mark Mitchell coming in, Tony Perkins, Jacob Cruz, Marquez Warwick, and probably a big guy to be named later, perhaps another name that I've forgotten off the top of my head. But regardless, hopefully Missouri can be a lot better because they're going to need to be against some teams that on paper should be better than them projections-wise. Teams like Arkansas, despite with new coach John Calipari and a different roster for sure. Oklahoma, Ole Miss, second year with Chris Beard at the helm. South Carolina showed a lot of improvement last year. And goodness knows Buzz Williams is always a tough out down at Texas A&M for Missouri. So nothing really obvious to report here. Just it is to say Missouri's going to have to play, to say the least, way better basketball this season if it hopes to sniff the bubble or the NCAA tournament. And if you're like me and you dive rather deeply into the bowels of the Missouri message board community, you may have found that there were some, quote, rumblings on Twitter this week, which is one of my least favorite phrases and just overall constructs. The idea that Twitter is a news source. Well, no, Twitter is a platform, x.com, whatever you want to call it, or whether it's that or it's Facebook or Instagram, TikTok, whatever it is, you can't source Twitter. That doesn't make any sense because there are people on Twitter who say things, but they don't say the same things. In fact, the obvious observation here is that, oh no, people argue all day on Twitter. So how can you just say, well, according to Twitter? Now you can say if Gabe DeArmond, for instance, or myself, if I say something on Twitter, feel free to say, hey, John Miller said. Please don't say Twitter said. That's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. But it still led to some rumblings on Twitter said that, hey, the SEC is looking to expand and Kansas could be a part of it. Well, if you did some digging there, you'd find out that this Twitter was some random person with no profile picture or real name that had, maybe 150, 200 followers or something like that. And again, if that's how many followers you have, nothing against you. But if you're not going to have a real name or face, why should I believe that? Why did anybody spend any time, again, in the bowels of the message boards delving into this, frankly, insane idea? I don't really see a world in which Kansas is added to the SEC. I don't know. I could be wrong, but it's certainly not based on anything credible at this point. Let's just be very clear about that. But you know what? Coming up on the program, I want to do something a little bit different. I want to talk about Caitlin Clark and superstardom. Why is she moving the needle so much? Obviously, she's a great basketball player, no question about that, but she's certainly not the first great female basketball player we've ever seen, and yet she seems to be resonating in a way that's very different than any other female basketball player before her. I'm very much interested in this topic, and I want to talk a lot about it and just stardom in general on the other side of this break. So Caitlin Clark does make her WNBA regular season debut tonight, and I've just been fascinated by her whole rise to stardom, and I've definitely gotten caught up in it. And I think part of it, at a certain point, when you get to a certain level of fame and popularity and notoriety, there is that thing that the kids call FOMO these days, the fear of missing out. I do think that particular phenomenon definitely started happening with Caitlin Clark either, but that certainly doesn't explain everything. You don't just get to that point overnight. Well, I think part of the reason, certainly, I think it starts with Caitlin Clark as a basketball player. She's just in the same way that Stephen Curry was different, and that all of a sudden, hey, who's this guy who's taking three-pointers 10 feet behind the line and actually making them? That was just a crazy thing to see. And really, Caitlin Clark, in a similar way, obviously a few years later, is this first woman to be doing it. So I think that, obviously, she has very much a lot of the same appeal that Stephen Curry does on the court. I also think, though, that she has something that Stephen Curry lost a couple years later in his career when Kevin Durant came aboard the team, because he was no longer seen as an underdog. For instance, when LeBron James was with the Cleveland Cavaliers the first time around, sure, you could say, oh, Stephen Curry and them, they could have been seen as the underdogs, but certainly not when Kevin Durant came aboard. Then the Warriors became sort of the empire, if you will, to steal a Star Wars reference. So the fact that Caitlin Clark was so good, but again, there's this South Carolina team, which was so great, was this big dragon that you had to slay, essentially, the sort of, that whole deal. I think that was a big thing. So to me, it was not just that, again, I'll say the elephant in the room here. It's not just because Caitlin Clark is a white girl. That doesn't really make any sense either, because not only have there been other great women's basketball players, well, there's been quite a few great white women's basketball players too. A few years ago, Elena Delle Donne, when she came up, one of the great basketball players of her time, without question. I'm just kind of spitballing here. I'm pretty sure she was a WNBA MVP, all of that good stuff. And by the way, in this humble broadcaster's opinion, one of the great looking people of all time too. So that definitely factors into your star qualities and your it factor and all that stuff too. So, but yet Elena Delle Donne never moved the needle. This is in a way that Caitlin Clark did. That's just an objective fact. So it can't just be her race. It can't just be that. That doesn't make any sense. But certainly Larry Bird, I'm going to even say it's not part of it. So like Larry Bird resonated. Well, I'm not saying his race had nothing to do with that, because especially at that time when basketball was becoming more and more of a black-dominated sport, and obviously remained so in many ways, well, Larry Bird was definitely different at the time. And not just because he's white, though, by the way, but because he's this 6'10" guy who's an incredible shooter, an incredible passer, and also he had Magic Johnson, too. Again, having a rivalry, a foil, is incredibly important, and especially a guy like Magic Johnson, who's also different in his own way, a 6'9" point guard. Again, the passing ability, that's something that Bird and Magic and Caitlin Clark all have in common, is that passing ability, which I think is something that people are really drawn to as well. So to me, Magic, Michael Jordan, they obviously had the charisma. Jordan, very different when he came out with his incredible athleticism and leaping ability. Both of those guys very handsome as well. That certainly factors in. And again, these guys were rivals. They were fighting for the same trophy. Great players who were great all at the same time. So why does Tiger Woods resonate? Why did Kareem Abdul-Jabbar not resonate? There is sort of a big guys versus guards things. Only Shaquille O'Neal has really ever been a national star. So there's just a lot of factors here. Again, one more I'll bring up here. I swear I'm going to bring this home pretty soon. Another thing I've been thinking about is why international athletes traditionally have not really crossed over in America beyond their local markets. If you think about, sure, Salvador Perez for the Royals or Yadier Molina for the Cardinals, to take a couple recent examples here, both of those guys are absolute stars in Kansas City and St. Louis, respectively, and in the state, and where people love the Cardinals and the Royals. They're huge stars and beloved. But does anybody care outside of Missouri? Not really. No kid in California is growing up wanting to wear Yadier Molina's shoes. I'm sorry. It's just true. Not in the same way that they want to wear Kobe Bryant shoes, for example. What international athletes have truly resonated? Wayne Gretzky, I suppose, but does he even count? A Canadian guy who speaks English and is a good-looking blonde guy who looks like every frat boy who went to the University of Minnesota? I don't know. It's interesting, though, because the great American stars, like the aforementioned Kobe Bryant, often do translate overseas big time. When the Olympics went to China in 2008, we could see that up close in person, what an enormous star Kobe Bryant was in that country. End of the day, I think the point is there is no answer for any of these people and why exactly they have stardom. It is a combination for sure. It's not a magical formula. You know, I mean, even the hot people, again, like Olivia Dunn, for example, the gymnast for LSU, a lot of people would say, oh, well, she's popular because she's attractive. Well, again, obviously that's part of it, but there are plenty of attractive college athletes, gymnasts. Why her? Well, frankly, part of it is because she posts all the time, works the SEO, the search engine optimization, the algorithm, all that good stuff. Regardless, in her case, she's cultivated an online presence and persona that is second to very few in this space. Again, the answer is there isn't an answer. There is no formula, but there are certainly variables. I think one of them is greatness, especially different greatness, being different athletically or indeed visually. Somebody like Jeremy Lin, for instance, when he came on the scene in the NBA, there's no doubt the fact that he was an Asian guy is definitely a different look for the NBA. That definitely factored in to his rise to stardom there. And by the way, being in New York was definitely a factor too. Again, I also think rivalries, a foe, a mountain to climb, some kind of journey, I think is really important as well. And of course, just overall the it factor, charisma, looks, sense of humor. I mean, any of that stuff can factor in. But for whatever reason, I think with Caitlin Clark, to me, it just comes down to she's a tremendous basketball player who basically has the Steph Curry appeal while having the Magic Johnson, Larry Bird appeal of being a great passer, wrapped up in she's also just seems like a very likable person. She has the girl next door appeal that is appealing on a lot of different levels to a number of different people. And bottom line is she's the kind of young lady, it seems like at this point too, as parents, you're going, well, hey, I wouldn't mind if my daughter looked up to her, that kind of thing. So it's just a whole lot of things melding at once. And frankly, as a fan of basketball, I hope she does incredibly well and continues to draw eyes to what is my favorite sport, whether it's the men's side, the women's side. I think it's all good. I would certainly love if my two young daughters would eventually fall in love with basketball like I have. And if Caitlin Clark had a small part in that, well, I would certainly thank her for that. And thank you all for listening to Locked On Mizzou today. And thank you for indulging that final segment that really didn't have a whole lot to do with Missouri basketball or football, but it is the off season. Thanks once again for indulging me. And thanks as always for listening to Locked On Mizzou.